Nightcast. Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth brings you the current news from the world today and how it relates to Bible prophecy. Understanding the end-time events leading to the peaceful world tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth.
Well, greetings, friends, and welcome to this March 13, 2014 edition of Nightcast. 1 year ago, the world got a new head of the Catholic Church, and Pope Francis has made big waves during the past 12 months. A survey of how Americans feel about the American pontiff is in our opening video.
One year ago, in Rome, the world got its first look at its new pope, and he's certainly changed the image of the pontiff. He's worn a fire helmet, he's held a lamb, he takes selfies, and of course, he takes to the Twitterverse. But what do people make of all this? A Pew Research Center survey of Americans found that almost 3/4 of Catholics represents a major change. More than half of non-Catholics think the same. Most Catholics in the U.S. like the way things are going overall, but only a slim majority think Pope Francis is doing a good job addressing sexual abuse in the Church, and that was one of their top priorities for the pontiff a year ago. Meanwhile, Pew Research also found some interesting stuff on Twitter. See, they analyzed tweets about both Pope Francis and Pope Benedict when he was still pontiff. 84% of Francis tweets were positive, compared to only 30% of Benedict tweets. Francis clearly has made an impression, even getting comparisons to, Superman. But it's not always positive for the pontiff. His critiques of capitalism have left many conservatives fuming. Some wonder if Francis is treated too much like a celebrity. Which also brings us to the so-called Francis effect. The idea that this popular pope has attracted more people to the Catholic Church. Pew Research found there isn't really any evidence of this among Americans. However, 1/4 of people already in the Church say they've become more excited by their faith in the past year. David Botti, BBC News, Washington.
Thank you, David. And for those of you who understand it, we opened up tonight with the first seal from our chart of 6 seals from the 6th chapter of the book of Revelation, the white horse. We open with that tonight. We'll go next to the 2nd seal from the book of Revelation, the red horse, which Jesus Christ described in plain language as a horse of war and rumors of war, and even nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom. World war, which nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, is what this situation in the Ukraine seems to be heading toward, with Russia involved, and the EU and the United States and other nations arguing about the outcome there. There are signs of increasing tension in Crimea ahead of Sunday's referendum on whether to stay with the Ukraine or join Russia. Britain's Foreign Secretary William Hague has called for the vote to be cancelled. John Simpson reports from Bakhchisarai.
Bakhchisarai, attractive but divided and increasingly nervous as Sunday's referendum comes close. Today, the banks here, like everywhere in Crimea, announced that people could only take out the equivalent of £20 maximum per day. This is Andrei Shokun, a Ukrainian community leader from Bakhchisarai, who, with a colleague, has suddenly disappeared, perhaps arrested, perhaps not. We went to speak to Shokun's family. No answer. A neighbour, too scared to be filmed, told us Mrs. Shokun and the children had gone into hiding yesterday. So I went to the town hall to see Bakhchisarai's genial and politically shrewd mayor. He denied blandly that anything bad had happened to Shokun and his colleague.
This is part of the information war that is destabilizing the situation in Crimea. I'm sure that they're all right. It's unbelievable. I've checked many facts in the mass media, and they're just not true.
Then on to the town's newspaper. If two big local figures vanish, that's headline news, surely. The woman who edits this newspaper, up there on the top floor, refused point blank to give us an interview because she said she might make the situation worse. She knows about the cases of the two men who've disappeared, but she wouldn't put it in the newspaper because she won't have heard about it officially. And there are other tensions in Bakhchisarai, at the nearby Ukrainian army base taken over by Russian troops, for instance. Some of the Ukrainian soldiers are stuck outside because the pro-Russian volunteers won't let them back in. They simply don't know what will happen to them after Sunday's referendum. They'll obey orders, they say. The volunteers are, as usual, aggressive and threatening. Bandits, the Ukrainians call them. More Russian reinforcements arrive. Officially, Moscow still denies that these are Russians. As with the two missing Ukrainian community leaders, truth is in short supply here. And in the meantime, on the other side of the Ukrainian border, 8,000 Russian troops have begun new military exercises. There's no doubt it's raising the temperature here before Sunday's vote. It's meant to. John Simpson, BBC News, Crimea.
And friends, if the vote Sunday changes the who gets what, if it happens that Crimea votes to go into Russia, it'll be the latest of many historic changes to Ukraine's borders. Bridget Kendall has been to the British Library to examine the many maps charting the peninsula's troubled past.
Momentous days in Ukraine, shaken by turmoil, bloodshed and division. And passions are being fired by history, as the old maps in the British Library's collection reveal. Let's start with Crimea, now the focus and flashpoint of this crisis, threatening to loosen ties with Kiev or even return to Russian rule if the pro-Moscow Russian speakers there get their way. And here it is, a tiny peninsula in the Black Sea, just below modern Russia and modern Ukraine. But in the 18th century, it was part of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, ruled by the Khan of the Crimean Tatars. Until, as in this map, Russia's Catherine the Great annexed it and made it part of the Russian Empire. And there it stayed part of Russia until 1954, when the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev decided to give it to Ukraine as a gift. That didn't matter too much when it was all part of Soviet territory. But then, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. And Russia and Ukraine found they were separate countries, with Crimea still part of Ukraine. As for the main part of Ukraine, it's always been pulled two ways. The West feels tied to Europe for good reason. Take Lviv, as it's called today, in the far west of Ukraine. In 1775, it was called Limburg and was part of the Austrian Empire. And in 1940, now part of Poland, it came under Soviet rule, part of a carve-up, a secret deal between Hitler and Stalin. Some Ukrainian nationalists saw Stalin as a bigger enemy than Hitler. That's why there's still so much suspicion of Moscow, the old occupying power. And that's why we keep hearing President Putin warning of the threat from right-wing extremists in western Ukraine. Old fears and mistrust, still shaping attitudes today. The further east you go in Ukraine, the more people see Russia not as an enemy, but as part of the family. Look at this beautiful 18th century map. Russian lands extend all the way to Kiev. The other side is Poland, and Kiev is where the Russian state began, and the Russian Orthodox Church over 1,000 years ago. It's almost sacred.
That's why President Putin doesn't want to let it go.
Bridget Kendall, BBC News at the British Library.
Thank you, Bridget. Friends, last night we showed you Chinese satellite images that were said to show debris from a missing Malaysian airliner. Well, according to Malaysia's transport minister, those images were released by mistake, he has said. Hashim Muddin Hussein also denied a U.S. report that the plane might have flown for hours after contact was lost with the Boeing 777. In a news briefing, Mr. Hussein said that the images were released by mistake by the Chinese and did not show any debris from flight MH370.
In the eastern Ukrainian city of Donetsk, meanwhile, there have been violent clashes between rival groups of protesters. One person was killed and a number were wounded when hundreds of demonstrators chanting pro-Russian slogans are said to have confronted a rival rally by people opposed to the Russian military intervention in Crimea, a sign there of how quickly this situation can get violent.
Okay, friends, very, very difficult to get away from the crisis in the Ukraine. That story just broke. So we got it on instead of the update on the Chinese missing flight where the images were released by mistake. Let's go for that story now.
We're here on the Israel-Gaza border in the rain. If you just look over there, that green area is where a lot of the rockets were fired from. Something like 100 rockets were sent over from there. And if we just look...
Friends, I'm going to stop that story for just a moment because apparently we don't have the video on the images being released by mistake, so not much more to say about that story anyway, other than the Chinese people, they made a mistake. They released those satellite images thinking it was debris from that missing airline, but it's not. And as a consequence, the Malaysian flight MH370 still remains missing and unknown as to what happened. All right, now you just saw a video where one person has died during violent clashes between rival protesters in the Ukrainian city of Donetsk. The clashes between the rivals began when hundreds of demonstrators chanting pro-Russian slogans broke through a police cordon and confronted a rally by people opposed to the Russian military intervention in Crimea. Pro-Russian protesters threw smoke bombs and firecrackers, and a fight broke out, as you saw in that video a moment ago. Now, friends, we've got the last couple of nights I've been telling you about the rocket attacks over the Israel-Gaza border. Tonight we do have video. Israeli warplanes have struck 29 targets in the Gaza Strip in response to a rocket barrage from Gaza into Israel, the military has said. Palestinians said missiles hit bases of Gaza's Hamas rulers and the armed wing of Islamic Jihad, which had fired the rockets. 4 more rockets were fired at Israel on Thursday, today. And we have a report now from Quentin Somerville from the Israel-Gaza border.
We're here on the Israel-Gaza border in the rain. If you just look over there, that green area is where a lot of the rockets were fired from. Something like 100 rockets were sent over from there. And if we just look to the right, you can see an Israeli army base. That is Gaza over there, but you can see an Israeli army base. It has protection against rockets. You can see that screening. Now, Israel responded overnight in what it says was an unprecedented fashion. 29 airstrikes to the north and then to the south of Gaza. If we just look down here, this is the town of Sderot. This is the target, if you like, for many of those rockets. Though most fell short landing in open fields, some did strike home. In Sderot last night, there were sirens blaring. People were told to get into shelters, to stay indoors as the missile barrage continued. It was the heaviest barrage that's been seen in about 2 years. Though the worry here, not just in Sderot but across Israel, is that this situation escalates. Hamas, who runs Gaza, say that they want the ceasefire with Israel to hold. Israel's Defence Minister Moshe Yaalon, he says that Israel is acting responsibly. So there certainly seems to be a will to contain this. That will be decided, though, in the next 24 to 48 hours along this area, depending on the levels of activity.
And friends, we have some news next that relates to Israel, to the people of Israel. Germany's president arrived in Athens yesterday on a 3-day visit that will include visiting the site where Nazi troops massacred dozens of people in an attempt to ease anti-German sentiment stoked by Greece's financial crisis. Joachim Gauck's 3-day visit will include a speech tomorrow, Friday, at a site where German army troops massacred 92 villagers near the northeastern town of Ioannina, and a meeting with the town's Jewish community. Citing public security concerns, Greek police have banned all demonstrations from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. today in a large area of central Athens where Gauck will be, even though no protest have been planned against the visit. In an interview with Greek newspaper, a daily newspaper that was published yesterday, Gauck refused to discuss demands in Greece that Germany should pay reparations for World War II atrocities. But, he said, Germany bears an undeniable moral burden, quote unquote, moral burden. Germany says it has settled all World War II reparations issues, and the Greek government has been reluctant to aggressively pursue the matter. But opposition politicians have seized on Gauck's visit to call for action. The left-wing main opposition party said President Papoulias should raise the issue with his German visitor, while the populist right-wing independent Greeks party accused Gauck of coming not as a partner, but as a conqueror. Germany rejected a demand last month by Greek Jews for compensation over a World War II ransom extracted to free Jewish slave laborers who were subsequently murdered in Nazi death camps. Anti-German feelings in Greece were remarkably muted after the war. But Greece's but Greece's financial crisis, which evolved into an economic depression amid the highest post-war unemployment levels, changed that. Germany is the biggest single contributor in Europe to the rescue loans that have kept Greece afloat since 2010, and has strongly backed deeply resented spending and income cuts demanded in return for the bailout. Now, I've got another story related to Germany and related to the Ukraine crisis. We'll close with that. The headline on this one is, "The Ukraine crisis may lead to an EU army." This is a story out of Prague from yesterday, dated March 12. Czech President Zeman hopes the present crisis in Ukraine would speed up the formation of a joint European army, he said at a press conference yesterday, marking the country's 15 years of membership in NATO. Apart from the North American pillar, A second NATO pillar should be developed, Zeman said about joint European armed forces. He said a joint military would be in line with further EU integration. So, friends, here we go. An EU, here's a proposal for a EU military. Zeman was Czech Prime Minister in 1999 when the country joined NATO along with Hungary and Poland. Czech Foreign Affairs Minister said the reinforcement of the European defense pillar was of key importance. Europe needs to be capable of bearing more responsibility for security in its neighborhood. Zeman said even the most optimistic estimates he heard from European politicians during his recent visit to Strasbourg said a joint European army could only be established within 10 to 15 years. He pointed out the situation in Ukraine is a security threat. And of course, situations like that could escalate or could accelerate and lessen the time before they get around to a joint army. A security threat and to any country is a threat to all of us, Zeman said. Zeman supported the view that Ukraine should become a federation and that free elections should be held as soon as possible. He warned against the possibility of the conflict spreading to other countries. However, Zeman failed to mention Russia has taken military control of Crimea, which is part of Ukraine. Zeman yesterday also criticized the cutting of the Czech defense spending and the use of money for armed forces, which he called ineffective. He said the redundant L-159 subsonic combat aircraft and the unsuccessful modernization of the T-72 tanks were examples of a waste of money. Zeman said the country has not been meeting the commitment of spending 2% of GDP on defense since 2004. He recalled that the defense spending is slightly more than 1% of GDP now. And friends, that's it for our report for tonight. God willing, and the creek don't rise, we'll be back for our next edition of Nightcast on Sunday. Until next time, friends, your host Stephen Lloyd saying have a wonderful weekend, and thanks for joining me. Until next time, so long, friends.
You have been watching Nightcast with Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth. Nightcast can be seen Sunday through Thursday nights here on COGTV.org. Tonight's program is also available anytime on demand in the COGTV.org video archive.